What if I told you that the most powerful leadership lessons in human history came not from conquest or speeches, but from complete silence? In the final 18 hours of the Carpenter of Nazareth's life, we witness leadership principles that defy everything we think we know about power, influence, and human psychology. While emperors commanded armies and philosophers debated in forums, one man revolutionized leadership through what he didn't say, didn't do, and didn't resist. Today, we're diving deep into the psychological mastery hidden in those final moments that continue to influence billions of people 2,000 years later. Are you ready to discover why silence became the loudest voice in history? The most powerful leadership method in 2,000 years has been hidden in plain sight. If you're building anything meaningful in your life, these psychological weapons will change everything you thought you knew about influence. Here's what most people completely misunderstand about that final night in the garden and the trials that followed. We've been told a story of passive suffering, of someone simply accepting their fate. But when you analyze the psychological dynamics at play, you discover something far more sophisticated and strategically brilliant. The carpenter wasn't just enduring torture and humiliation. He was orchestrating the greatest leadership demonstration in recorded history. Think about the context. Here's someone who had spent 3 years commanding crowds, performing miracles, and challenging the most powerful religious and political authorities of his time. He had followers ready to fight for him, resources at his disposal, and the charisma to potentially start a revolution. Yet in his most critical moment, when everything was on the line, he chose something that goes against every instinct we have about leadership and power. He chose silence. But here's where it gets psychologically fascinating. This wasn't the silence of defeat or confusion. This was calculated, purposeful, strategic silence. When Pontius Pilate, the most powerful man in the region, directly questioned him, he gave no defense. When the high priests hurled accusations that could have been easily refuted, he remained quiet. When soldiers mocked and tortured him, he offered no resistance or retaliation. To the casual observer, this looks like weakness, like giving up. But to understand what was really happening, we need to dig into the psychology of power, influence, and what modern research tells us about the most effective forms of leadership. Because what the carpenter demonstrated in those hours challenged every assumption about how real authority works and created a leadership model that has influenced more people than any emperor, general, or politician in human history. Here's the psychological breakthrough that changes everything. The carpenter was using what modern psychology now calls moral authority reversal. Instead of defending his position from a place of weakness, his silence was creating a psychological dynamic where every word from his accusers actually weakened their position and strengthened his. Think about what happens when someone remains calm and silent in the face of aggressive accusations. The psychological pressure builds on the accuser, not the accused. Pilate, despite holding all the official power, found himself increasingly uncomfortable, asking more desperate questions and ultimately declaring he could find no fault in this man. The high priests, despite having the religious authority, became more frantic, more accusatory, more obviously motivated by jealousy rather than justice. The soldiers, despite having physical dominance, were reduced to mocking and theatrical cruelty that only highlighted their own moral bankruptcy. But here's where it gets even more sophisticated. The carpenter wasn't just using silence as a defensive strategy, he was using it as a teaching tool. Every person watching was getting a masterclass in what genuine strength looks like under pressure. His silence was speaking volumes about the difference between positional power and authentic authority. Positional power needs to defend itself, needs to prove itself, needs constant validation. Authentic authority simply exists. It doesn't need to argue because it's not threatened by false accusations. Modern neuroscience research on mirror neurons shows us that when we witness someone remaining calm under extreme pressure, our brains literally mirror that calmness, creating a deep sense of respect and trust. The crowds watching weren't just seeing someone suffer, they were witnessing someone demonstrate a level of internal security and strength that was completely foreign to their experience. This is why early followers later described feeling transformed by witnessing these events. Their neural pathways were literally being rewired by observing this level of psychological mastery under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Let me break this down. with a simple analogy that will make everything click. Imagine you're watching two people argue in a restaurant. One person is shouting, gesticulating wildly, making accusations, getting red in the face. The other person sits quietly, maintains eye contact, occasionally nods, but says absolutely nothing. Who do you instinctively trust more? Who appears more in control? Who has more authority in that situation? It's always the quiet one. That's exactly what the carpenter was doing, but on the largest stage in human history. His silence wasn't passive. It was active psychological leadership. He was demonstrating that true authority doesn't need to defend itself against lies because truth has its own power. When someone is secure in who they are, when their identity isn't threatened by external attacks, silence becomes the most powerful response possible. This is why his silence was so unnerving to his accusers. They were used to people fighting back, making excuses, trying to prove their innocence. But when someone doesn't take the bait, doesn't engage in the drama, doesn't feel the need to defend themselves against false accusations, it exposes the weakness in the accuser's position. The psychological principle at work here is called non-resistance authority. It's the same principle that makes great therapists, wise mentors, and truly confident leaders so effective. They don't need to prove they're right. Their presence and consistency prove it for them. Modern leadership research shows that people in high-stress situations are instinctively drawn to whoever appears most calm and centered, not whoever argues the loudest or fights the hardest. If this is exploding your mind, stop now and hit subscribe. The algorithm will hide my next secrets from you. Now let's examine the second psychological mystery that most people completely miss. Even while hanging on the cross, experiencing the most brutal form of execution ever devised, the carpenter continued to lead. But how he led from that position defies everything we think we know about leadership psychology. Traditional leadership theory tells us that leaders need to be strong, invulnerable, in control. They need to project confidence, have answers, and never show weakness. The carpenter shattered every one of these assumptions while nailed to a piece of wood, bleeding, struggling to breathe, surrounded by mockery and hatred. Yet from that position of ultimate physical powerlessness, he demonstrated leadership principles that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. He turned his execution into a leadership laboratory. When one of the criminals hanging next to him hurled insults, joining the crowd in mockery, the carpenter said nothing. But when the other criminal defended him and asked to be remembered, he immediately responded with compassion and assurance. This wasn't random kindness. This was sophisticated emotional intelligence in action. He was demonstrating selective engagement, one of the most advanced leadership skills. He ignored the destructive voices while nurturing the constructive ones. When he saw his mother in the crowd, devastated and watching her son die, he didn't focus on his own pain. Instead, he arranged for her care, making sure she would be looked after. This is transformational leadership at its peak, maintaining concern for others even in personal crisis. When the soldiers were gambling for his clothes right beneath him, treating his death as entertainment, he asked for their forgiveness. This wasn't weakness or naivety. This was demonstrating a leadership principle that modern conflict resolution experts now call radical empathy. He understood that their cruelty came from their own psychological wounds and limitations, not from his failures. But perhaps most remarkably, he maintained his leadership identity even while dying, still teaching, still guiding, still thinking strategically about the impact of his actions on those who would carry his message forward. Here's the psychological revelation that will change how you see leadership forever. The carpenter was demonstrating vulnerable authority, a leadership style that modern research shows is actually the most influential form of human connection possible. Traditional masculine leadership models tell us that showing weakness destroys authority. The carpenter proved that showing authentic vulnerability while maintaining your core identity actually multiplies your influence exponentially. Think about what was happening psychologically in the minds of everyone watching. Here was someone who had claimed to be a king, who had taught about love and forgiveness, who had built a movement around serving others rather than being served. Now he was in the ultimate test of whether those teachings were real or just impressive rhetoric. If he had broken down, cursed his enemies, begged for mercy, or abandoned his principles under extreme pressure, his entire message would have been discredited. Instead, He lived out his teachings under the worst possible circumstances, proving their authenticity in a way that no amount of preaching could have accomplished. Modern neuroscience research on what psychologists call costly signaling explains exactly what was happening when someone maintains their values despite significant personal cost. It creates a profound psychological impact on observers. Our brains are wired to recognize authentic character versus performed character, and extreme circumstances strip away all pretense. The crowds watching weren't just seeing someone die, they were witnessing someone prove the reality of everything he had taught through the ultimate character test. This is why one of the Roman centurions, a career soldier trained to recognize strength and weakness, declared, "Surely this was a righteous man." His professional assessment of human character was that he had just witnessed someone operating from a level of internal strength he had never encountered before. The psychological impact was so profound that it began converting people immediately. They recognized they had witnessed something unprecedented, someone whose authority increased rather than decreased under the ultimate pressure test. Here's an analogy that makes this crystal clear. Think of a master craftsman demonstrating their skill. Anyone can claim to be excellent when conditions are perfect, when they have the best tools, ideal lighting, and no time pressure. But when you watch someone create something beautiful with broken tools, poor lighting, and hostile conditions, you know you're witnessing true mastery. That's exactly what the carpenter was doing with leadership. He was proving that authentic leadership isn't dependent on ideal circumstances, supportive environments, or favorable conditions. Real leadership reveals itself most clearly when everything is working against you. The psychological principle is called adversarial validation. When someone maintains their core character and continues serving others despite facing the worst possible circumstances, it validates everything they've ever said or taught. Their suffering becomes the authentication process for their entire life message. This is why people who witnessed these events became willing to face their own persecution and death to spread the message. They hadn't just heard teachings about love, forgiveness, and sacrificial leadership. They had seen those principles proven genuine under the ultimate stress test. Modern psychology recognizes this as one of the most powerful forms of influence possible. When people see you live your values when it costs you everything, they develop an unshakable trust in both you and those values. It's the difference between someone who talks about courage and someone who demonstrates courage when they're actually afraid. The demonstration always trumps the explanation. If you're watching this far, you are different. Prove it. Like now and subscribe for all the next secrets. Now we come to the most psychologically complex mystery of all, the moment that has puzzled scholars, psychologists, and philosophers for 2 millennia. In his final moments, the carpenter cried out words that seem to contradict everything we've analyzed so far. My God, why have you forsaken me?" This appears to be a breakdown, a moment where his psychological strength finally cracked under the unbearable pressure. But here's where modern psychological research reveals something most people completely miss. This wasn't a breakdown. It was the ultimate demonstration of authentic leadership through radical honesty about human experience. Think about what had happened psychologically during those 6 hours on the cross. This was someone who had lived his entire adult life with an unshakable sense of connection to divine purpose, who had taught about never being alone, who had promised that faith could overcome any obstacle. Now he was experiencing something unprecedented in his life, a sense of complete abandonment and isolation. Lesser leaders would have either maintained a false facade of strength or completely collapsed into despair. The carpenter did something psychologically brilliant. He articulated the full human experience of suffering without abandoning his core identity or purpose. He was showing that authentic leadership includes the courage to voice genuine pain and confusion while still maintaining hope and direction. This is what psychologists now call emotional granularity, the ability to accurately identify and express complex emotional states rather than either suppressing them or being overwhelmed by them. But here's the deeper psychological insight. By crying out this ancient psalm, he was actually demonstrating his continued connection to his spiritual and cultural identity, even in extremis. Psalm 22 doesn't end in despair, it ends in triumph and vindication. He was essentially saying, I'm experiencing the dark night of the soul that every hero's journey includes, but I'm still anchored in the larger story. This level of psychological sophistication, maintaining identity while honestly expressing human vulnerability, is what separates transformational leaders from mere performers or pretenders. Here's the psychological revelation that connects all three mysteries and explains why this leadership model has influenced more people than any other in human history. The carpenter wasn't just demonstrating individual leadership techniques, he was modeling what psychologists now call integrated authentic leadership. This is someone who remained fully human while operating from transcendent principles, who showed strength through vulnerability, who maintained authority through service, and who achieved victory through apparent defeat. The psychological sophistication of this approach is staggering. Throughout his final 18 hours, he demonstrated every major principle that modern leadership psychology has identified as most effective. Emotional regulation under extreme stress, selective attention to constructive versus destructive inputs, consistent behavior that matches stated values, empathy for opponents, concern for followers' welfare over personal comfort, honest expression of human experience without losing larger vision, and non-violent resistance that exposes the moral bankruptcy of violent systems. But what makes this psychologically unprecedented is how he integrated all these elements while facing the ultimate human fear, death, and the ultimate leadership challenge, maintaining influence when you have no institutional power, no resources, and no apparent hope of success. Modern research on post-traumatic growth shows that humans are capable of their greatest psychological development through extreme adversity, but only if they maintain certain cognitive and emotional frameworks during the crisis. The carpenter demonstrated every single one of these frameworks, finding meaning in suffering, maintaining relationships during isolation, developing inner strength through external powerlessness, and creating legacy through apparent loss. The psychological impact was so profound that it created a completely new model of human potential. People who witnessed or heard about these events began to believe that they too could maintain integrity under pressure, show strength through vulnerability, and influence others through service rather than dominance. This wasn't just leadership, it was a demonstration of advanced human psychological development that proved ordinary people could transcend their limitations through internal transformation rather than external power accumulation. Here's the final analogy that brings everything together. Imagine a master chess player who agrees to play a match with one hand tied behind their back, blindfolded, while sitting on a bed of nails, with their opponent allowed to change the rules mid-game. Everyone expects them to lose quickly and humiliatingly. Instead, they not only win the game, but do it in such a brilliant way that spectators understand chess at a deeper level than ever before. They didn't just demonstrate skill. They redefined what skill means and proved that true mastery transcends any external limitations. That's exactly what the carpenter did with leadership. He took every disadvantage, no political power, no military support, no institutional backing, facing the most brutal circumstances imaginable, and used those constraints to demonstrate leadership principles so advanced that we're still studying them 2,000 years later. The psychological principle is called constraint-based innovation. When you remove all external supports and advantages, you're forced to develop internal resources and capabilities that you never knew you possessed. His final 18 hours became a masterclass in pure leadership. Leadership stripped of all external props and based entirely on character, principle, and inner strength. This is why his influence grew rather than diminished after his death. People realized they had witnessed someone prove that authentic authority comes from who you are, not what position you hold or what resources you control. Every person who understood this lesson became capable of their own form of transformational leadership, regardless of their circumstances or limitations. He had shown that true power is internal, that real authority serves others, and that lasting influence comes from demonstrating principles under pressure rather than just talking about them when life is comfortable. These three psychological mysteries reveal the blueprint for authentic leadership that transcends time, culture, and circumstances. The Carpenter's final hours demonstrated that real authority comes through service. True strength shows itself in vulnerability, and lasting influence grows through sacrificial love rather than self-preservation. His silent leadership model continues to transform millions because it proved that ordinary humans can access extraordinary levels of psychological and spiritual development. The leadership lessons from those 18 hours remain the most powerful because they're based on timeless principles of human psychology rather than temporary strategies or cultural trends. This is leadership that works in any century, any culture, any crisis. If these secrets exploded your mind, you need my next videos, but only if you hit the bell. Otherwise, you'll miss history's most powerful secrets. What's your opinion on these ideas? Comment below. Send this to that friend who gets it. This analysis is speculative and based on historical and psychological interpretation of public records, not clinical diagnosis.